Good evening. Today we are going to have a really exciting session. The session is part of a broader year-long webinar series on expanding the frontiers of economics, and we are collecting evidence from South Asia. We are learning from different disciplines, from sociology, psychology, political science, and we are collecting gems, theoretical and empirical gems from them, and trying to enrich economics as a profession, as a body of knowledge. So with that, I'd like to ask Anisha to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Satvik. It is my pleasure to introduce to you all Dr. Chinmay Tumbe. Having completed his master's from London School of Economics, he pursued his PhD at the Indian Institute of Management at Bangalore and worked extensively on migration and remittances in the Indian context. He has held positions as assistant professor at the School of Public Policy and Governance at Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Hyderabad, as international visiting scholar in the business history at Harvard Business School, and presently is an assistant professor at the Indian Institute of Management at Ahmedabad. He created the first wave with his book, India Moving, published in 2018, which was, as the tagline suggests, a history of migration. And he created the second wave with his book, The Age of Pandemics, which is the topic of today's session. His recent works highlight all that we have experienced in the pandemic, and we have definitely benefited a lot from the historical perspective and understand how these pandemics shaped India and the world. We're extremely delighted to have you with us, Chinmay. The screen is yours.
Great, thanks a lot for this very kind invitation. I never set out to write a book on pandemics before the pandemic arrived. And I wrote this book primarily because it seemed to me that when WHO announced this as a pandemic last year in March 11th or 12th, 2020, the kind of information that I received on, say, WhatsApp, on social media was perplexing, so to say the least. For instance, there were messages saying India has never been the source of pandemics. China has always been the source of all pandemics. Our fantastic diets give us tremendous immunity against all pandemics. And I must say, some of these conversations may be still there, but I think the second wave has at least killed the immunity argument substantially. But because we on reported COVID death numbers, we were looking very good against US, though Angus Deaton's charts show that India was not doing too well, even in Jan, if you compare India against 200 countries. But if you selectively compare India against America, Germany, UK, it was, of course, intriguing across 2020 that it was the richest countries of the world which were actually most hit by the pandemic. And so all sorts of speculations and stuff like that happened. Now, I'm talking about March 2020, when the pandemic was announced, my decadal work on migration often encountered pandemics, especially the historical aspects. So when I studied migration in the past, I often came across pandemics. So I knew that migrant workers would rush back home, when a plague struck Bombay, for instance. It was the most common response of migrant workers, in fact, in a pandemic, is to try and get home. There were a lot of other things. In fact, my PhD thesis, had a chart on a district level population growth chart of India, between 1911 and 1921, which shows you the massive impact of influenza, for example, of 1918 out there. So while I was not an expert on pandemics, I realized I was uniquely situated to write something about it. And that's how really I got into this project on pandemics. Now, having written to it, of course, I see a huge link between my earlier work on migration. One is, as a researcher, I'm interested in mainly three disciplines: economics, history, and demography. And in a way, my first book was on migration, and the second book is on mortality. So, there are three pillars of demography: fertility, mortality, and migration. And so, in a way, the two books are connected. The other way the two books are connected is that you cannot actually have a pandemic without some migration. A pandemic, by definition, requires some mobility in order so that the virus spreads. And that's why every pandemic requires a curtailment of mobility, whether it's international, internal, we talk about that in this session. So there's a very close link. And that's why last year, for example, you remember we got a migration crisis, which was kind of unprecedented in India because of this close connection between pandemics and migration. So that's the context in which I set out to write this book. And so now I'm going to get to some slides. Right. So this is a particular age, the age of pandemics, 1817 to 1920. And I look at three pandemics, and the focus is in India because India lost a lot of people in that. This particular picture on the cover of the book shows you the response to the plague pandemic. It's a photograph taken in the late 1890s, at a time when people did not know what was plague. In the sense, the disease was known in terms of how it looked, what it did, but nobody knew what caused plague. And today we know that there's something about rats and rat fleas and human beings and the transmission, but the instinctive response of people was disinfection. And so it's an interesting image because what they're doing in this picture has no relevance when you actually know the science of plague in actually curtailing plague. Right? They're using like a flushing pump to hose down or literally clean a building. This is not how you deal with plague today. Right? In the sense that if plague came, this is definitely something you would not see. But it kind of tells you the first thing that when a pandemic arrives, when a new disease arrives, we are really struggling for answers and we try out different things. The close parallel is, how many of us might have sanitized virtually every object that we, touched. Every delivery item which came home last year, was, completely sanitized. My mother would literally wash 3-4 times even these Amazon cartons, kind of extreme paranoia. Why? Because we fully didn't understand the transmission mechanism. Today, of course, we know surface transmission is like really, really, really unlikely to get you COVID. Right? It's basically airborne. Surface transmission is not really the way COVID is happening around. So in a way, the response to what we did back then is very similar to this picture that you're seeing right now. It's a completely, on hindsight, it's a very different response. And that's the whole thing about the pandemic. It's the sheer uncertainty which creates panic and rumor mongering among the population. I'll start with two important things which are quickly relatable. This is a picture from last year, 2020, of this crazy migration crisis that India witnessed, where thousands of migrant workers, hundreds of thousands, my estimate is 30 million people moved back. Not all of them walked, but about 30 million people moved back last year in some form or the other. And because the Indian railways were shut down, at a very short notice, 4-hour notice, the entire Indian railways were shut down. They had no option but to walk back home. And this, if you're a student of economics, is very interesting, or just public policy, and of course history, because history tells us not to do such things. History has a very clear bearing on how does one deal with migration in a pandemic. So I'm going to start with what the British thought about migration. And so this chart that you're seeing on the left is the identical situation of migrant workers fleeing a city. Only difference is that it's about 120 years back. Right? And so if you look at the expressions, one is an illustration. It's very similar. You see the woman holding the child on the left. You see the man holding the child on the right. They're both in the same grip of leaving the city, going back home. On the left, people are leaving Bombay Station when plague had arrived in 1896-97. Now, in both cases, the governments had to make a decision. How do we contain the pandemic? Right? And of course, in the British, they made a lot of mistakes in policies, some of it shall recount, very costly mistakes. But on migration, actually, they got it much better than what we got it last year. Okay, so when you look at the British documentation of that time, it's very interesting. They say, should we shut down the railways or not? The same decision that Indian policymakers were facing last year. And they came up to this remarkable conclusion that is, even if they shut down the railways, because migration in India is so circular, where migrants have 1 foot in the village, 1 foot in the city, they said, even if we shut down the railways, people will walk back home. This is a remarkable insight that British policymakers had out then. And they said that instead of having people walking all over, might as well have special trains. Let's get them back home so that at least they're going along routes that we can monitor. Right? And so we can quarantine them along those routes and basically monitor the public as they're going back. But if they're walking, we'll completely lose all surveillance and the epidemic can go anywhere. Right? And so they arranged the special trains. Now, Indian government last year also arranged the special trains, but it was 2 months late. Right? So you remember the Shramik train started on 1st May last year, but that's more than a month of the crisis had already happened. And the decision, of course, to lock down and not let migrants go back was, of course, very noble. The idea was that if we shut down everything, if we contain migrants in the cities, the virus spread to rural areas will be contained. right? So there is, of course, an epidemiological kind of a logic in order to have a very stringent lockdown of that kind. But the economic reality is such that precisely because we know the statistics, a large part of Indian labor force is very informal. Daily wages lose their jobs, but even people who have a holding capacity of a few weeks, they get very nervous. And the problem last year was that there was no credibility for the end of the lockdown. So, the first Prime Minister's speech, which had nothing for the migrants, it said 3 weeks, then it became 1 additional week, then 1 more week, and that's when the uncertainty really, really started kicking. Right. So what we learned from history actually is that internal migration is really hard to curtail. Like international migration is very simple. You can shut down the planes, you can shut down the ports, and nobody will come. So nobody's going to swim from UK or England to Bombay, but you can always walk back from Bangalore to Bihar or take a cycle. Right? So there's a basic difference between international migration and internal migration. State borders are very porous. You can all, what we saw last year, we saw people going to these checkposts, and because the state borders were sealed, they would just walk down a few kilometers and continue their journey. Right? Now, this is not possible with the international. You can shut down international borders on internal borders in the same way. And when the imperative is the same, that is the migrant is in the city for economic security, considers the village to be the site of social security. So when the migrant is basically, then the economic security dries up, when the jobs dry up in a lockdown, then the first instance is flight. What's also interesting is that in both these cases, a very similar phrase was heard. Even on this platform, as I write in my book, this particular phrase was heard, ki agar marna hai to gaon mein marenge, which basically translates as to something like, if you're anyway going to die, we might as well die in the place where we were born. And this is very poignant because this was heard in 1897 and this was heard in 2020, which also tells you a non-economic reason of why migrants want to go back home. Right? This is a cultural attachment to land, which is very strong in India, especially among male migrants. These are mostly, men that you're seeing in the picture, who want to basically, the ashes have to be kind of scattered in the place of their birth. So there is a psychological response also in a health crisis of going back. So it's an interesting kind of illustration of a response of a very important public policy choice to be made in a pandemic, and two contrasting decisions. And in this particular case, of course, we got it much worse than the British. Of course, there are other things that we did well, but this was clearly not one. This is another important point to kind of bring home the relevance of history, because a lot of people today say the second wave in India was brutal, but we simply could not anticipate it, right? Which to me is absolute rubbish, because this is a chart from 1918. This is a chart which should be plastered on the walls of every public office in India, because this is precisely what can happen in a pandemic. You have a first wave, you have a second wave. There is virtually no relation in the size, between the first wave and the second. This chart is basically from the work of Siddharth Chandra and others. I have other work, similar maps and charts and so on, but it's a great chart. The y-axis is excess fever-related mortality. So this is using death registration statistics to calculate excess fever-related mortality, which is also, by the way, something very sensible they did. They said, look, if you're dying of fever in late 1918, it must be influenza. Compared to our testing protocols today, you can be counted COVID dead in India only if you're COVID positive, which is ridiculous because so many people have died who have not tested positive. So our official COVID death numbers today are completely a function of COVID testing capacity. Right? States which have good testing capacity will show more COVID deaths. It's as simple as that. Right? Whereas 1918, they had a much smarter way, because actually, judging by our protocols, nobody died in 1918, right? Because nobody was tested positive for influenza. But they had a smarter way of coming out with it. So this is first wave, April, May, and the second wave, each line is a district, and the thicker lines are for provinces. And you'll see, for example, central provinces was the worst hit. Western and northern India was much more hit in the influenza pandemic then. But I'll come back to this chart later. But I'm starting off with these two, different visuals, one of migration and one of different waves in a pandemic, because they kind of tell you how important history is in economics, in public policy, in a variety of disciplines. And that's, for example, why I tend to keep looking at the history of a variety of issues that I work on. So this book has two core arguments. One is, of course, an argument on history itself. It's very crudely saying, oh, but they didn't teach me stuff in the school textbooks. This is a very simple argument that everyone makes. Oh, we were not taught this in schools, right? I would argue that, for this, it's really relevant. right? That the fact that the greatest demographic disaster in Indian history is not in our school textbook is a problem, right? The fact that, when we look at this period 1870 to 1920, we think of this as a period, or not just we, say global historians look at this as a period. Think of Eric Hobsbawm, one of the greatest historians of the 20th century. He wrote these, massive volumes on the 19th and 20th century. Epidemics are a tiny part of it. And the reason is very simple. This age of pandemics, which I'm talking about, did not really hit Europe and North America. So if you're going to read books on global history from a Eurocentric point of view, it did not really affect them. So why should it be there in their books, right? But as I point out in this book, Asia's share of global population in this period falls down by a stunning 15 percentage points, from 65% to 50%. Typically you would have heard arguments of the percentage of GDP falling. Think of Shashi Tharoor's famous thing, 16%, 1600 India had certain part of global GDP, then it falls, and hence India, poor. Now that's a particular construction of argument. But nobody's realized that actually even the share of global population, there's a demographic shock that happened in the 19th century. So the 19th century is not just a period of economic divergence, it was a period of demographic divergence, where the West grew ahead. Basically, they survived the pandemics much better. Or let's put it differently, the pandemics really didn't hit them. The pandemics had a disproportionate impact on Asia, and within Asia, the worst affected country was India, right? And this central part of our, what historians call historiography of the narrative, was simply not taught in schools, right? In the sense that probably the only thing we heard in our schools may be something about the plague, and again, in relation with the freedom movement. But 1918, the worst, you're going to see the numbers, 20 million Indians dying, and not in our textbooks, is something remarkable. And that's one of the reasons I've written this book, because believe it or not, this is the first book with a comprehensive treatment of one of the world's greatest demographic disasters, which is influenza in India. Now, there are many books written on 1918 influenza, but they don't really cover India. So John Barry has a best-selling book on influenza, the 1918 pandemic. It has one paragraph in 500 pages on India, despite India having half the global mortality. Right? So India has been blindsided in the global literature on pandemics, and within India, it has been blindsided in the general history. So pandemics has kind of slipped out of our collective memory. And that is why the core argument is that there's huge value in remembering it, because there's actually a lot we can learn from that, in a way saying that we've been there before, and we can actually learn a lot from that. And I've shown you two basic lessons. For example, how do you deal with migration? And secondly, the fact that pandemics come in waves and one has to be prepared for different types of waves. So here's the broad overview of the pandemics I look at. Cholera, plague, influenza, three big pandemics. Cholera is long lasting, it's for more than a century. Plague is for about 25 years core in India. And influenza is actually just a few months in 1918, but different parts of the world it hit in more than 2 waves, some places 3 waves. And so by 1920, it kind of disappears. As diseases go, cholera and plague are bacteria-based diseases. That is why the antibiotics technology which emerged in the 1940s kind of killed these diseases. So most biologists will say we have a much better lead time over bacteria-based disease than virus, right? So that's one difference. I should also say that when influenza struck in 1918, they thought it was bacteria, right? We actually, what hit people in 1918 was a mystery until the late 1990s. For nearly 80 years, nobody really knew what had happened in 1918. That's a separate story in itself. These biologists, they recover tissue samples from the 1918 corpses and they reconstruct the virus using the technology of the late 20th century. So there was really no way in 1918, they thought it was a first bacillus. It was not even a bacteria, it was a virus. I should also point out, when this WHO announced this as a pandemic last year, there was a sense that, we can easily manage this pandemic because, our science and technology today is fantastic. But this is a kind of, again, a linear kind of model in our heads, because in 1917, a year before influenza, they had just had 50 years of tremendous progress in science and technology. They had basically conquered, cholera to a large extent. They had, invented a lot of vaccines. Yet in 1918, this pandemic comes and kills 40 million. Okay. So collectively, these pandemics killed more than 70 million people. That's more than the number of people killed in World War I and World War II. Right. And, Eric Hobsbawm does not have too much to say about pandemics, but a lot to say about the world wars. In India, over 40 million people died. Right? And India was the worst affected in each of the pandemics. And I should also say that adjusted for underreporting, India today is the worst affected country, even in the COVID-19 pandemic. Right? So if you look at COVID-19's death scorecard across the world, right now, USA is number 1, Brazil is number 2, and India is number 3. But you adjust for the underreporting, and India is definitely number 1 right now. Okay, so unfortunately, we've been number 1 in 3 past pandemics of those times. We are not number 1 in HIV/AIDS, thankfully. We have given that mantle to South Africa and some other countries. But in other pandemics, unfortunately, which also raises a larger question, why is it that we're not learning? Then the fact is that it's a repetitive kind of issue. Just a quick note that I have a working paper, which is a supplement to this book. It's freely available online. So you can just Google it. It's called Pandemics and Historical Mortality. It's a 90-page supplement, which has it's the statistical appendix to my book. So my book doesn't have the numbers and charts. That's all in the appendix, which is this. And so all these numbers that I'm going to show you are coming from a lot of painstaking research, putting together massive digitization of historical mortality statistics, between 1870 and 1940, mainly for India, but also for other countries. So it's a huge bunch of charts and analysis in that working paper. And there's also an extended bibliography, about 200 to 300 studies on this subject. So let's quickly go through now some of these pandemics. Start with cholera. Cholera, bacteria-based disease, starts in eastern India. Cholera has always been around in history. It starts off around Jessore. So you see the date, 28 August 1817. And it takes about 1.5 years to reach Sri Lanka or Ceylon. So you see 19-19, that's January 1890. Right? So this is a very different world in the early 19th century. There are no railways, there are no steamboats. It takes a lot of time for disease to spread, as opposed to COVID-19, which took a few weeks to go around the world. Right? So that's the difference in the worlds we're talking about. This is a world in which there is no great medical advantage conferred by Western medicines compared to, say, Ayurvedic or Unani medical systems. The British are dying at the same rates as the Indians in the early 19th century in the Indian subcontinent. Okay, so this is the kind of world it's living in. And it kind of spreads from Eastern India, where it is endemic. Cholera was there even before 1817, but we said it becomes unusually virulent. So there's a kind of a mutation, and most pandemics happen because of these kind of things, a mutation which makes it very dangerous. Right? So that's the most accepted theory of this pandemic. Now, how does it spread? And that's the whodunit mystery of the 19th century as to, how does it really go about? Because the reigning theory across medical traditions in the early 19th century was that all diseases are due to impure air, what is known as the miasma theory of diseases. Right? And we now know that cholera is a waterborne theory of disease. Okay, and so that's a dramatic paradigm shift which takes place in the 19th century. The ability to concede that diseases are not airborne but can happen through other means. Right? And the guy who figures this out is a guy called John Snow in England. But despite John Snow's breakthrough in 1850s, medical officers in India, British medical officers in India, do not accept that theory that cholera is waterborne, and accept the theory 40 years later. Okay, so in that 40 years, millions of Indians die because British officers in India were too smug to accept John Snow's theory. So while Britain invested in good water purification systems to control cholera after 1850s, India did not. In the few places they did, they managed to cut down cholera. Like piped water entered Calcutta in 1869, cholera started going down. But across India, it was just not on. And cholera starts, diminishing only when the science. So, the lesson is broadly that if you're steeped in, outdated scientific paradigms, there's simply no way you're going to kind of overturn a pandemic. And so cholera is not really a problem in Northern America and Western Europe after the 1860s. It's a disease of mainly dehydration. These are kind of pictures of cholera, what it does to the body, bacteria-based disease. The eventual cure came only in the late 20th century, what we now call as ORT, oral rehydration therapy. Right? And this is, on hindsight, it looks ridiculously simple as to how cholera can be treated. Right? It's a fascinating story of how, when you put together all the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, you kind of get a sense like, oh my God, millions of people could have easily survived if you just gave them a package of salts. Right? It's one of those big enlightening moments of science. And I'll tell you about a bit of that scientific progress in a bit. But you could die within 4 hours. Just to give you a sense of how dangerous it was, case fatality rates which is basically out of say 100 people who get cholera, how many people die, was more than 50% for the bulk of the 19th century, which means if you got cholera, pretty much you were gone. Plague, by the way, case fatality rates were 80%. So if you got plague, you were almost definitely dead. Okay? So that's how bad the case fatality rates were. Cholera starts going out of India from the 1820s. It takes years to reach Europe, about 1830s. And this is a nice cartoon which kind of shows you, it says an overabundance of useless advice concerning protection against cholera. So basically, nobody had a clue as to how do you deal with cholera. Right? It just came and wiped off hundreds of thousands of people wherever it went, and nobody really knew what to do with it. Since I think this audience is more of the economic kind, this is an interesting kind of cartoon showing the economics of epidemics. Right? This is a kind of a skeleton figure saying, you'll have to come down with your rents. I intend to occupy these premises myself. Right? And this is the classic economic response in the pandemic, that is, people flee the cities, and in times of economic closures, basically the economy suffers. And so it's not all pandemics have been economic disasters as well. Right? This is a generalization you can make across. It's just about how big a disaster. Right? But cholera, plague, influenza, all of them had a massive economic impact. And that's one of the arguments I make in my book. That is, we typically tend to think of the economic divergence between India and the West in terms of drain, in terms of British exploitation, etc., etc. But actually, the big elephant in the room of the 19th century is pandemics. It's like saying, Indian economy tanked in 2020 because of bad fiscal policy. We know it's not that. We know it's the context of the pandemic, right? And yet, when I did economics and economics history, all I learned about bad economic performance in the 19th century was terms of trade differences, drain theory. Nobody told me that people were scared to go out because of pandemics, just like how we are today. Right? And so that's a recurring theme in my book, that is these continuous epidemics, cholera first, then plague, and of course, eventually influenza, put a huge, break on economic activity. By the time you reach plague, I have accounts in my book of, there's a guy who works with Singer, which is a multinational sewing company, sewing, like the sewing machines. And this guy is complaining to his New York head office saying, I can't do business because there are quarantines everywhere and I can't travel. This is again something I never really realized how big of an impact the economic impact of epidemics in the 19th century were to kind of keep, and the fact that they were not happening in the West meant that this was an additional source of the growing divergence in economic outcomes between the West and in India. Okay, so in the US, it was really devastating in 3 years. Of course, it was there in other years as well. And note that whenever cholera hit Europe and US, they did not call it cholera, they called it Indian cholera, right? Just like many people call Chinese virus and so on. Right? And so India for this 1 century was known, unfortunately, as a source of pandemics, right? And that's the thing which hit me last year when I got these WhatsApp messages saying India has never been the source of pandemics, because for 100 years, India was actively blamed for not doing enough, by which we mean British India was blamed for not doing enough to control the spread of pandemics. We now know that not all those outbreaks were directly linked to India. So it was unfair to single out India. It kind of became endemic in certain places. We now know that cholera lives in certain, maritime systems. It can get endemic and break out differently and so on. Egypt was one of the worst affected countries in the world in terms of percentage of population, very badly affected. Russia was another country hugely affected. Again, a chart to show you social distancing on the bridge. And this is a quarantine center. So quarantine systems came into huge focus. Nobody used the word lockdown. The word really was quarantine. And how do you slow down economic activity back there? So Russia was an important country which got hugely affected by cholera. Tchaikovsky, the famous music composer, died of cholera, and so did his mother. Now, this here is a fascinating chart for a social science research in India. In fact, I think if you ever take a research methods course in a PhD workshop, use this chart. John Snow figured out that cholera was waterborne by showing you a chart of Broad Street, Soho. It's a famous chart. If you ever do GIS, that's how you start a GIS class, by showing John Snow's map. This is how he identified the leaky, pump, and this is how he identified cholera to be waterborne. Though actually there was another experiment he did, water companies, neighboring houses and so on. The point is, this idea that cholera was waterborne was refused by British officials in India. But a few people were listening to what John Snow had to do. and the response that was happening in Europe. And so this is a chart by a guy called MC Fernal, who was a medical officer in Madras Presidency in South India, who was enlightened enough to question his superiors. Finally, by some accounts, lost his job because he did that. But he wrote a book as In Your Gut title saying Cholera and Water in India, right? Because he was trying to make this point, look, we're wrong, just accept it that cholera is waterborne and not airborne. And so the way he did that is very interesting. He used a village level map in Tamil Nadu, or let's call it Tamil Nadu now. And he points out that on one side of the street, all the high castes are living, and on the other side, low caste. And this, anybody who's gone to a village in India knows the stark residential segregation. Now, here's the kicker. He says, there's point A and point B on this map, which is the wells. So these are the wells. And he's saying, interesting, in this village, only the high caste got cholera. Okay, so he said that the wells were contaminated, and he says nobody on the other side of the street got cholera, not the contraction or death. Okay, why? Because they all drank water from sources outside the village. Because this is how village India is constructed, right? And the one person who died of cholera in the low caste was the washerman who happened to work on the other side of the street, right? So he said, water, water, water. This is the water connection running through the stream. He's saying, look, and I find this really interesting as a researcher. This is how a great kind of intuition to kind of portray a point. And he was, of course, bang on right. I should also say, while in this particular case, the upper caste, the death rate was higher, in general, across these pandemics, death rates were much higher among the poor and the low castes. Okay, so, so marginalized castes had, death rates 5 or 10 times higher than, say, the Parsis or the Brahmins and so on. Okay, so there's a lot of data to support that. But in this particular case, it's the reverse. Again, so that's what he's making this point. I think vaccination was another big, improvement which happened. There's a guy called Valdemar Haffkine who comes to India to test his cholera vaccines. Haffkine is like the biggest name in late 19th, early 20th century India. In fact, you would not have India's Serum Institute, which is India's biggest, the world's biggest vaccine manufacturer by some accounts. If Haffkine had not come to India, other Poonawalla would not have been in the vaccine business. There's a direct part dependency out there. Why? Because Haffkine, came to India to test his cholera vaccines, persuaded to stay on to manage plague. He comes out with plague vaccines, and his lab in Bombay then becomes something called as the Haffkine Institute, which is still there today and has just been pressed into service to make vaccines against COVID. And the Haffkine Institute, by the way, was also making vaccines and exporting it, just like Serum Institute doing right now. So India's vaccine, why is it that India is such a good vaccine producer, has a long history? It's precisely because we were not so badly by pandemics in the past that we had a response through vaccine, which is about 100 years ago, right? And that's why even today, many countries don't have access to vaccine production, but we do. And interestingly, the Poonawallas, who are horse breeders, they got into vaccine production in 1966. Why? Because they were interacting with the Haffkine Institute. Why? Because their horses used to be prey to snake bites, and they used to get these snake venom kind of thing, antidotes from the Haffkine Institute. So that's the connection. And as they interacted more with Haffkine Institute, they said, what, let's get into the vaccine business. So they kind of backward integrated out, right? So it's a good, plausible hypothesis that if Haffkine Institute was not there, they would never have gone into the vaccine business in the first place. Okay, so I'm also pointing this out for another reason. Today, a big question on vaccine is vaccine hesitancy, right? And vaccination hesitancy was huge in the late 19th and early 20th century. The way they kind of conquered it from time to time was to basically have massive public communication. There was also a case where Haffkine was implicated, of a crime because there was an adverse event. Some people died of the vaccine, but they found out it was not the vaccine, but the infected syringes. So there's a lot of drama in this whole, scenario of vaccination. But the interesting thing is, in 1930 or so, the Haffkine Institute has a very interesting paragraph in its annual report to the effect where it says, where earlier there used to be a riot if you pressed for vaccination, now there is a riot if the vaccine supplies run short, right? Which kind of tells you how this mindset shift happens in those 30 years as people realize that it is working, right? And of course, that took a long time on a particular disease. And today we are seeing, just from January to now, I would say there's been a huge shift. Yes, there is still vaccine hesitancy, but there's been a huge shift. Why? Because of the second wave. And the second wave has made the imperative of the vaccine so clear to everyone that literally where there was a shortage earlier, where there was a riot if you press the vaccine earlier, now literally people are getting upset if the supplies run short. So how was cholera finally won? I mentioned John Snow showed that it's waterborne. Robert Koch identified the bacteria. Leonard Rogers, an officer in an Indian medical service in Calcutta, cut down case fatality rates under 20% using intravenous injections. So before ORT, they realized that since cholera is essentially about dehydration, it's about rehydration to kind of cure it. I should also point out, how does cholera really spread? They call it a fecal oral transmission mechanism, which means you ingest it through liquid, say water, and then you have a discharge. And if the sewage systems intermingle with the drinking water systems, that completes the loop. Right? So the core aspect of getting rid of cholera is to always keep sewage systems and drinking water systems completely apart. That is why cholera kept hitting army camps. It kept hitting, refugee camps, all these kind of places. Right? So wherever people camped and they had the discharges and the drinking water sources very similar, it would happen. Pilgrimage sites, right? Kumbh Mela. Kumbh Mela is a classic thing. They identified a clear relationship between Kumbh Mela and cholera outbreaks. Why? Because people would go there, they would bathe, right? So fecal oral and they would, drink the holy water. Even worse, they would take the holy water back home and sprinkle it in their pots, right? So it's kind of the perfect way if you're from the cholera's point of view, it's the perfect transmission system, right? And so not surprisingly, pilgrims were singled out in this period as being particularly bad. Now, of course, the Indian pilgrims' response was, we've been having these pilgrims for thousands of years. How dare you stop us? So the Indian pilgrims also had a point. And they said, if you're saying it's waterborne, you invest in better sanitation facilities. But that's what the British did not do. And so the British kind of took the shortcut and said, you are the cause of cholera, and looked at the British basically made the Indian pilgrims as a scapegoat, right? Which was, of course, in my view, not fair. Not just the Indian pilgrims within India, but also say Muslim pilgrims in Hajj. And so a very elaborate quarantine system was put in place by the British to make this up. I'm saying this because, the idea of the super spreader is very strong in pandemics. We saw this last year in India. The Tablighi Jamaat was made out to be a super spreader and so on. But in cholera, especially, the pilgrim was the classic sort of super spreader in that particular time. I move on to plague. When plague arrives in a big way, again, plague has been there throughout history. Nobody really knew what happens. Black Death, Europe, most famously 14th century, but a third of Europe was knocked out. It hits London in a big way in the 1660s. But by 1720, Europe has seen the last of plague. And so that's why the response to plague is over the top. When the British realized that plague has hit Bombay in 1896, they go completely nuts because they have the memory of plague hitting London in 1660s very much alive. Right? And so if you look at the documents of the time, they're always relating to what happens in 3 centuries ago. And that's the interesting part about public policy response if you have it in your history. Okay, so they go all over the top and they implement a law which we are still using called the Epidemic Diseases Act of 1897. Right? So that's the clearest connect between those pandemics and now is that even today, India's response to this pandemic is through a legislative cover, which was provided by the British first against plague. Right? But before that, the first response to plague or any epidemic was praise. Right? So just like last year, we had Go Corona Go and all these famous jingles, very similar kind of responses that we had back then as well. Okay, a lot of very cruel surveillance systems put in by the British. This is a person being disinfected. We saw similar images last year, by the way, when migrants were returning. You would have seen those images of being piped down with water and so on. We now know in hindsight that this didn't really matter for plague at all. Since plague was about rats and rat fleas, none of this actually mattered. But the British went overboard and they kind of made the Indian subject body as a kind of disciplining mechanism. Right? So a lot of excesses were done in this period. And that's why the first big response after 1857 uprising was really after plague. A British official was assassinated in Pune. Gokhale Tilak, go hammer and tongs after the British. So it really creates a lot of the sentiment against the British is because of the direct intervention in the daily lives of Indians. Example of temporary hospital for plague victims in Bombay. Okay, now this is a really interesting chart because I started this discussion with this idea that one of the things people love to do in pandemics is to ask this question, why is it hitting some parts of the world and not others? Right? And all of us have our pet responses, right? And this, like what I call the Panipuri Hypothesis in India, which basically says that if you can eat Panipuri outside on the streets and nothing happens to you, you are immune against all classes of disease. Right? This is the Panipuri Hypothesis. And of course, I've heard variants of this over the last year in a variety of conversational settings. right? Oh, we have great bodies. Or the foreigners fall sick for anything. There was this argument that precisely because we grew up in unclean environments, we have reactive immunity against disease. There is virtually nothing in science which tells us about such sort of relationships, right? And this is a good chart to explain about how not to fall into this trap of over speculating on regional variation. This is a chart which tells you where plague was hitting, and it's basically the Western Ghats in the Ganga kind of basin. Basically, UP, Punjab, Bombay presidency got the bulk of the plague victims. And not surprisingly, you had the officers in Calcutta and Madras boast about how well they had done to keep plague at bay. Just like the Indian government, in January, February this year said, how great they had done in keeping COVID away. The fact is that we still don't know a lot about COVID. And in the early 1900s, people really didn't know much about plague, right? And so what Calcutta and Madras got was plain good luck. It turns out you need a particular kind of a rat and a particular kind of a rat flea in order for plague to be very efficient in its transmission. And those particular kinds of rats and particular kind of rat fleas were simply not available in Madras or southern and eastern India to a large extent. Right? So there's a whole disease ecology, which is why in this particular case, plague was much more endemic or epidemic in the Western Ghats and the Ganga. Right? But the kind of takeaway from this is that one has to be very careful. I mean, one has to use science to come to an answer of why the pandemic was there in certain places and not others, and not go with kind of gut feelings. An example of a plague certificate, a lot of vaccinations were done for plague, throughout the early 20th century. As you can see, no photograph of any British Vice Chancellor, Governor General of India. Today's vaccination certificates have chief ministers and prime ministers photographed and so on. We just had a thumb mark and the inoculating medical officer's signature. Very, very humble certificates back then. Plague went around the world, but India was the most affected. Out of the 13 million reported deaths, 12 were in India. So we're saying more than 90% of the deaths were in India. One country where it went and had a huge impact in terms of the response was Brazil. Again, I'm singling out Brazil because if you see this pandemic, America and Brazil got it really wrong. In the sense, India, at least, last year we didn't actively diss the science. America, Trump and Bolsonaro actively dissed the science behind COVID. They made fun of the virus and all sorts of funny things in that. Thankfully, our prime minister did not do anything like that. And I say this because Brazil, in the response to plague, got the best Brazilian scientist who was being trained at the Pasteur Institute to basically come and basically set up their entire public health system, which is which held them in good stead for the rest of the 20th century. And that's the kind of response they had against plague compared to what they had last year. And of course, what's happening in Brazil is outrageous in terms of the death per capita and so on. So plague really didn't hit Europe too much. It didn't really hit. China was another country hugely hit. Early example of PPE kits. This is China during 1911. Interesting thing about this particular incident of 1911 and Manchuria is again about migration. I mentioned this incidence of British sending back people through special trains. In the 1911 plague outbreak in China, they did exactly what the Indian government did last year. They shut down the trains for migrant workers. Why? To contain the pandemic. And what do you think they got? They got a humanitarian crisis where people started walking back home. Right? So we have now two examples from history, the Indian response and the Chinese response, even before what we tried out last year. So when people say, oh, it was unanticipable or it was unprecedented, it's simply not true. And because it was January 1911, which is the severe winter of China, people died in the cold walking back home, rather than plague, so to speak. Right? So it's interesting because there was a case from history that when you shut down the trains for migrant workers in a pandemic with very little notice period, and if you don't provide maximal social security in the destination regions, their response is to go back home. So you have to you need to anticipate that. So plague was finally won, through a variety of ways. I put the photo of Savitribai Phule because she died of plague and she had created a clinic for plague. And this also to underscore that a lot of the frontline workers in the fight against pandemics throughout history have been women, either as caregivers at home. So a lot of times because they are nursing, they are more susceptible to get infections if those infections were contagious. So a lot of times death rates were higher among women than men, just because of this simple aspect. Okay, so Savitribai Phule started a clinic with her son, and unfortunately she died of plague in Western India. Kita Sato and Yersin were the guys who identified the bacteria in 1894. And William Liston, who was born in Secunderabad, so he's Indian-born fellow, part of the Indian Medical Service. He's the guy who, it's again a fascinating story. He identifies the link between the rat and the human via the bite of the rat flea. It's one of those great discoveries of humankind. Because think, throughout history, plague has been the most dangerous disease from the perception level. Okay, the deadliest disease arguably for human beings throughout history has been malaria. Okay, not plague. The malaria still kills thousands of people around the world. But plague was deadly. If you get malaria, you get a fever. But if you get plague, you get these huge lumps on your body. It was a terrifying disease to see, right? And so that's why you have good descriptions of plague throughout history. And when William Liston, posited this idea of the rat flea and so on, people thought he was mad, saying that no, it's because of the filth. Because the one thing that happened with plague was that rats started dying, and then humans started dying, typically with a 10-day lag. And Liston said, no, there's a link between the rats and the humans. And so he found this out in Bombay. He wrote a lovely paper, which I think, again, we should use in methods courses in India. It's called Rats, Fleas, and the Plague. And it was published in the Indian Medical Gazette in 1905. It's those groundbreaking papers which completely shakes the science of field. And again, as I said, born in Secunderabad. And next time I go to Secunderabad, I'm going to tell those officials to put a statue in his honor. He's one of the guys who should be recognized in India's pandemic history. I come now to influenza, and I'll wrap up now with this. I've gone through the second wave. The point about the numbers, 6 million deaths was the initial number. This is a newspaper article. The first time, so back then also they had these death scorecards, but they were not aggregated. So you knew how many people were dying in Delhi because the Delhi newspaper would tell you how many people were dying in Delhi at the end of the day. Right? But nobody had really aggregated till the sanitary commissioner officer did it in March 1919, and he said 6 million deaths. Now we now know that it's not 6 million, but about 20 million. Right? So the number was revised over time using various methods. Again, my own research kind of used, district level data. So this is a chart which shows you boundaries of today. So these are 2001 district level boundaries, backcasting data of 1911 and 1921 to the district boundaries today. And if you see the population falls, it's mainly, in Western and Northern India. But it also shows you how badly Rajasthan and, Madhya Pradesh were affected. These are the worst affected places. Basically, this is just a chart showing population fall. It's a population growth rate. The yellow shaded regions are basically negative population growth rate. This is the only decade of the 20th century where India registered a negative population. Indian population from 1901 till now has always seen it growing, except for this one decade because of influenza. Right? So influenza was that catastrophic. Again, I have an argument as to why so many people died was because influenza kind of was on the back of a massive rainfall shock. So India registered its third worst drought in recorded history in 1918, a few months before influenza struck. Right? So it's not just influenza. We got really unlucky that year that it was influenza plus the drought. Right? And so I use this I code the 1918 rainfall data, shock kind of data, again in the district boundaries of today. And you see just broadly Western and Northern India much more hit. This is just a visual correlation, but it kind of works out very nicely in a regression framework. Okay, I'm not going to regression table. But my argument is basically that the influenza mortality was an economic induced, an economic crisis which translated into mortality. So that is, what happened was that basically because of the drought, food prices started shooting up in certain parts of India. And because you could survive influenza if you had basic nourishment. But if you were malnourished and took on the disease, you were a goner. So this is just a province level kind of scatter plot. But it shows you that not all provinces of India saw inflation that year. Now, typically in India, if you had food surplus regions and food deficient regions, you would have the Indian railways to meet demand supply, right? Mismatch. What happened was in 1918, the third big shock was that World War I was happening. And so the entire Indian railways was pressed into the war effort. Right? So all the food grains were being exported, not all, but a large part was being exported to Mesopotamia to feed the troops out there, to serve British's war effort. So we had a triple whammy. We had the drought, we had the food price inflation, which should not have happened if the railways were being used for diverting food stocks to deficient areas. As a result, we got inflation in certain parts of India. You'll see Eastern India, like Assam, Bihar, they were having deflation. They didn't have an inflation shock. But it's Western and Northern India which got an inflation shock, and it's precisely in those places where you got excess mortality. Just some numbers to show you how bad the inflation was of food prices in that 70-year period, 1918-20 was the worst period for food price inflation in that period. I'm going to skip on this in the interest of time, just to tell you that troops, which is a constituency which was well fed, they did not suffer too much, and there was not much north-south variation in terms of their case mortality rates. So it didn't matter whether you were living in North India or South India if you were in the troops, because you were well fed. But if you're part of the general population, you are much more likely to die of influenza in North India than in South. Again, here's the kind of way to look at really the economic argument of what I'm trying to say. The chart on the left is rainfall shocks, and the three worst years of Indian history are 1877, which gave you the 1878 famine, 1899, and 1918. And the chart on the right is for one part of India called Berar, which is central India, and it shows you the mortality shocks. So the red line is the death rate, right? And you see what's happening. The three big droughts of Indian history, recorded Indian history, correspond to the three big shocks of mortality in India. 1877 drought, and you move to the chart on the right, the next year you got massive spike in famine deaths. 1899 drought, 1900 you got the famine. The difference of 1918 was that you got the drought and the deaths in the same year, right? And that's because they died of influenza. The counterfactual is, of course, that influenza did not come. Some people would have died of a famine the next year anyways. In the sense that typically famines and droughts had a lag of about 1 year, because food stocks would have to go down and then the starvation deaths would start, right? And so that's the kind of big picture view of this relationship between water scarcity, nutrition deficiency, and pandemic-related mortality. I'm going to wrap up now, just to tell you about how bad influenza was in economic terms. The worst economic year on record in the last 20 years in India. This is a chart showing GDP growth rate on the x-axis and inflation on the y-axis for the last 120 years. What's really interesting as an economic student is that the two worst years of Indian history were both pandemic years, 1918 and 2020. Right? 1918, GDP tanked by 10%. 2020, it's tanking by about 8%. 1918 was much more inflationary, 30% inflation. This time it's much less. I think the numbers are 5%. Don't go by the dot I've shown you out here. Right? Which also tells you that pandemics, unlike the Great Depression, which was a deflationary shock, the 1930s Great Depression, pandemics are not only economic crises, but they are supply side shocks, and hence tend to be more inflationary. Right? This is also one of the kind of observations one sees across pandemics. Okay, this is just a public health protocol of 1918. I'm going to skip over this just to kind of tell you, pandemics had a huge impact on India's freedom movement, labor movement, cooperative movement. Happy to take these questions, but a lot of legacies of those pandemics. And I'll end here by pointing out what I call the stages of a pandemic, not the epidemiologist way. Epidemiologists characterize a pandemic in terms of community level transmission and certain stages like that. What I call as, let's call it the social stages of a pandemic. It seems like people live in denial, like say February last year, where people say, oh, nothing can happen to us. Then there's complete confusion because nobody knows what to do. Then there's acceptance that, okay, we're in it for some time. But pandemics, unlike wars, unlike earthquakes, unlike floods, unlike any other classes of mass mortality, also get easily forgotten, right? And now I wrote this book in 2020, and I was, comparing it with 100 years back, saying, how people have forgotten these pandemics. I did not know that we would forget what happened in 2020, by the time we came to 2021, right? Because, I had all my students in Goa, partying in February and March earlier. Everyone thought this pandemic is over, right? I mean, this is the general societal level response out there. And the argument I'm making is very simple, that societies which erase less are less likely to be in denial mode next time around. And so you're going to see less confusion, and basically you're going to be much smarter in addressing the pandemic the lesser you forget. Because pandemic is not just about how the government intervenes, it's also about the society intervenes, right? And it's arguably because of this that East Asia has been spared of the excesses of this pandemic so far, is because they were subjected to SARS and swine flu in the last 20 years, right? So they kind of know as a society, they know what to expect in an epidemic arc. Right? Whereas for us, really, this is the first time since 1918 which it has hit us in a big way, right? And so this is the kind of way I kind of characterize the pandemics. So with that, I'll end. I've gone way over time. I run a history internship at IMA and also have a social media handle on history and so on. So happy to take questions,
All right,
Okay.
before we open up for the question answer session, let me just say that this session was jointly organized with the help of Julia from the History of Economic Thought and Sergio from the Economic History Working Groups. We're very glad that they have collaborated with us to bring such a beautiful session to play. Sergio, over to you.
Thank you, Anisha, and thank you very much, Chinmay, for your great presentation that brings a whole new perspective to pandemics. We've seen probably more than 100 talks already on COVID-19 and pandemics, but I think this is a whole new perspective with this migration aspect to it, and revisiting the historiography of not only India, but the entire world in terms of how to understand the economic crisis and pandemics. So I'm just gonna go and give them the room to Diana, who has the first question, and then we have Shyam and Aaron. I do ask you, please, given the time constraints that we have, to keep your questions short, please. Diana?
Thank you so much. So thank you for your presentation. I appreciate that you are studying and investigating past pandemics and not the recent pandemic, because everybody's too concerned about producing thoughts and saying intelligent things about something that is still happening and undergoing. So I appreciate that. I think you're starting from the right place. Let's look first at the past time frame, very tight, and let's see how it goes. Second thing, I much appreciate your interdisciplinary approach, which I think it's the right type of economics, one that dialogues with other disciplines. And I could say a lot of things. I don't agree with several approaches that you took, but we don't have time for that. So I'll just keep it very, very, very short. The numbers aspect. How much can you rely on numbers that are provided from the past? Because in the past, the numbers that you have are based on symptoms. So people count it as having a disease because it was very obvious from the symptoms. Now, if we would want to study the pandemics, the ongoing pandemics, we have numbers that are based even in no symptoms at all. So what do you think we could do? And for example, for some strange reason, it seems that the current pandemic skipped the whole entire continent of Africa, because of course there are no ways of measuring effectively. So how do you think that that would impact a future historical approach to the current pandemic? That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. Sorry, let's wrap the three questions that we have here on the floor, and then you can answer them. So Shyam, if you want to go next, please. You want to turn on your sorry, Shyam, there seems to be there seems to be a problem with your speed connection. So I'm gonna.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Not quite. Do you want perhaps to type your question in the chat and we can read it for you? In the meantime, Arun, if you want to go ahead.
Thank you, Sergio, and thanks, Chinmay, for the wonderful talk. I'm really looking forward if I could get a copy of your book also. But the thing is, and I know your talk also reminded me about a work by Professor T.V. Shekhar, who recently wrote about, sometime back wrote about how the influenza pandemic happened, and the reaction to the province of Mysore was different from the reactions and the steps taken by the then colonial Indian government. So, I mean, that is also a kind of message that we can probably take out from this, that the reactions of certain certain princely states that time was different from what happened in colonial India. And why was it different? I mean, so what basically I understand that there was some epidemic in the beginning of the second half of the second decade of the 19th century, 20th century in Mysore, and as a reaction to that, they had started a lot of public dispensary public health mechanism improved better, and thus the influenza did not really matter. But also importantly, the data collection, the tracking was much better. So, I mean, I like the fact that you're really connecting this with the history with the macroeconomics and everything, but also this could also be a good chance for people like you to thrust on the data issues that India is facing. In terms of, I mean, I'm a demographer also, so I can say that SRS data is not yet out. Migration was always an issue, migration data. And I mean, I was really, really looking forward also to know, you talked about 30 billion going back. I mean, I don't know where. I also probably talk about the data source that you use for getting that. But the migration data situation in India is really bad. Even the data that is available, that was available, like the SRS, is not being getting released. Even GDP data have an issue. So this is also a chance for really focusing on the quality of data. Thank you.
Thank you, Arun. And I'll just read Shyam's question. How can our experience of past pandemics shape the post-pandemic policy? How can we use the information that we have to reduce the phase of erasure of the pandemic from our memory? So Chinmay, you may now answer the question. Thank you very much again.
Great. Yeah. So 3 questions. Right. So first one, Diana's question. Yeah, sorry to disappoint you, but I am working on the current pandemic as well, in the sense that I am a member of the independent Lancet COVID-19 task force for India. And I also happen to give literally daily updates, daily updates to Dr. VK Paul, who's a COVID chair. So and my effort is to track.
Then you are not writing history. Perhaps you're making history,
No.
but you're not writing about it yet.
No. Concerned with issues of the present, but I'll tell you how important the history is. And since the specific question is on data quality, counting, how do you count these things and so on. There's no doubt that the massive. I mean, I've been working on this over the last 1 month. The massive underreporting of deaths in India. In the months of this thing. But just again, the value of history in doing this. First is about how do we measure deaths in the pandemic. It's not just about whether the symptoms are. There are 2 basic ways. One is this method of excess mortality, right? So you look at basically all-cause mortality deaths in a particular period and see how it's heightened in a particular time. So that's one method that suffers from problems of coverage, death coverage, completeness, under-registration, all those things. But the way I arrived at my 20 million estimate for influenza is not using those numbers at all. It's coming from the census. It's coming from the overall population counts, simple population counts. So what I do is look at district level data, 1901, 1911, 1921, 1931, using the power of 4 censuses to see what is the shortfall in the 1921 census, right? That is, you can see pre-trend and post-trend growth. So this has nothing to do with the death data. These are population count data. And that is why there are basically 2 methods, excess mortality and intercensal growth rate projections. And it's based on that I have some of these estimates in the paper. Of course, there are a variety of, I have a whole paper on the estimation of this thing, comparing with other researchers. So we can be quite confident now that the estimates of influenza mortality in India, it was, over 15 million for sure. From multiple methods, it's kind of a triangulation system, which is coming to those estimates. Unfortunately, for the current one, we are stuck with is the excess mortality method, because that's the only data we're getting in real time. That we are scraping for this information. No government is really releasing this data. And so we have to wait for the next census. The census should have happened this year. It won't. So now, whenever the next census comes, that's how we'll get to know how many people died in the northern states of Bihar, UP, which have very poor death coverage. You can't do much with excess mortality there. Similarly, with most countries in Africa, where you have poor death coverage, the census might be some gauge, the next census, to find out, some way of doing it. But you're right that, of course, you can't conclude 30 years later that the pandemic didn't hit Africa at all. You'd have to be very sensitive to really what's happening there. All I can say is that a lot of researchers now are estimating global mortality using a variety of methods. So we'll come closer to the truth, hopefully. But I'll just show you 2 charts, if you give me this permission, from another slide deck of mine. 1 second, sorry. Right, can you see this?
Yes,
Right.
we
So
can.
this is what happens in a pandemic. November 1918. The y-axis, the x-axis is basically years, and each line is the death rate for the month. This is all India figures for British India, right? And you see the death rates are pretty flat in the sense, I mean, it varies from month to month, year to year, but not that much. But when you see a pandemic, this is the signature of the pandemic. That is in 1918. Look at November 1918, which is this line. It goes up. The death rate for that month goes up by 5 times. Right? It's not 5, 10, 20% variation. It is 500%. It's that kind of massive jumps that you see in a pandemic. So these are the signature effects of a pandemic. And I'm going to show you a very similar chart for this year, right? Which is basically this. This is the state of Andhra Pradesh in South India, one state which we have data for. This is from the work of journalist Rukmini. It's different months. You look at the x-axis here, it's different month, January of the last 4 years. And look what happened in May 2021. It's 5 times. That's the kind of spike you're seeing. And this is now nothing to do with how you're measuring it, whether it's a field. This is all-cause mortality, right? And this is the clearest way to really gauge. And Andhra Pradesh, by the way, has 100% death coverage if you compare it with sample registration systems. So now, unfortunately, you can't use this method for states like Bihar, UP in the north because they have very poor death coverage. You might find, yes, they are excess death, but I would be very skeptical of any figure which comes. So there are, I think, good ways now to get closer to the truth. And obviously, we can't say that, one of the things we should stop doing, of course, is use the reported COVID deaths per capita as a metric in any regional analysis. That just doesn't tell you anything. If you're in India, the reported COVID deaths per capita in Karnataka in South India is 4 times higher than its neighboring state, Andhra Pradesh. But the excess deaths per capita in Andhra Pradesh is much higher than what it is in Karnataka. So it's completely altering, what we are seeing. It's not even in the same ranking. The ranking of Indian states is going to completely change once we take into account excess deaths and so on. So a lot of us actually working on this, this different, this is the data for Madhya Pradesh, for example, same 5-time kind of, not this is maybe 3-time effect. It's going up from roughly 40,000 to 4 times, right? The month of May, that's why I'm saying May 2021 is about as horrific as November 1918. I'm not saying 20 million people died, but given the usual deaths, the spike in 1 month is just incredible. It's kind of unheard. I would say since November 1918, we have never seen something like this in India. This is the signature of a crazy raging pandemic. And of course, all of us in India have been affected by the second wave to some extent. We all know, somebody, I think, within our extended families or friends who have kind of died, not just got COVID. So it's been a very crazy situation this year, for sure. Sorry, I'll stop this. Yeah, the second question, which Arun was pointing out, one is, of course, T.V. Sekar's work, which is cited in the book. I do call out the errors in British policy. So I think one strand from your thing is, did princely states of India do a better job in pandemic management than the British? And I'll be very wary, because anytime you say pandemic management, I think pandemic management is only one part of various other things, like just plain luck. Like, Bombay and, like I said, Calcutta and Madras officers never really got plague because they got lucky. It's not because they were great officers. Right? But you're right that Mysore did do a fantastic job in managing influenza. And T.V. Sekar documents, what the Bombay Municipal Corporation did this time: chase the patient policy, go to the patient's house rather than the patient coming to the hospital, so that you reduce the strain on the hospitalization system. This was done in Mysore, as T.V. Sekar has shown back then. I told you about that guy, MC Fernal, and cholera and water and so on. The one person in India who wanted to hear more about this water connection was the Maharaja of Travancore. So another princely state which was taking, trying to understand the best practice. In fact, in this MC Fernal's book, at the end, he has an appendix of the letter of the Maharaja of Travancore, saying that, look, at least somebody's interested in this idea that I had, the correct idea on hindsight. But Arun, the larger point is that, for those who don't know, if you see the Indian subcontinent, the princely states comprised of 40% of the landmass and 20% of the population. Right? Why this difference? Because much of Rajasthan is desert, and so has huge area, but less land, less people. Now the fact is, Arun, that Mysore and Travancore are typically taken as the progressive rulers and so on. But there are only 2 out of 500 plus princely states. Right? You have Nizam ruled Hyderabad. You have the princely states of Rajasthan. You have all the princely states of Central India. You have Jammu and Kashmir. You have Saurashtra. There are 500 plus princely states. Right? And if I look at influenza as an event, there is no difference between British ruled districts and princely states. And in fact, the worst affected places were Nizam ruled Hyderabad and Rajasthan. Right? And these were princely states. So again, in the counterfactual, we tend to think of princely states often in terms of Mysore and Travancore as being better. But I would argue there are also princely states which are, as bad as the British, if not worse. Right? And so this is the whenever we think of princely states, I think we need to put out the full picture of princely states, right? And then try and make a reasonable kind of counterfactual. And there's no doubt that the British overlooked the 1918 crisis because they were more obsessed about World War I at that point. I should say, Arun, there's a paper now which looks at the identity of the bureaucrat, the district collector. Right? And it basically says in 1918, in districts where the district collector was Indian, you saw fewer deaths than in where the district collectors were British. So it's a paper which just looks at British India, right? And just says the identity of the district collector. That's a paper by one Gao, G-A-O, he's at Stanford. Right? So it's an interesting research paper. Again, the idea being that, you had a closer connect if you're an Indian officer, you felt more for your people and so on. It's an open question. Right? I don't fully accept that because, what explains Hyderabad, what explains Rajasthan. I think that's, and the third question was out here. Shape the post-pandemic policy. I think the thing we really need to learn is that you need to document the pandemic. Right? That is not just by books, but by official government reports. Because cholera and plague were long-running epidemics, the British would literally have annual reports on those epidemics. Right? You had these regular plague commission reports. Many of the things in those reports on hindsight turn out to be wrong. Like the first plague commission report had a completely wrong idea of how plague gets transmitted. But it's precisely because that wrong idea was documented that a guy like Liston could question it and then eventually come up with the correct idea. Right? Unfortunately, this time around, we don't see documentation. We don't see. I've still not seen a parliamentary standing committee on the report on, say, the migration crisis of last year. So we need to do a better job in documenting the current crisis. It's unlikely to happen, but we should be doing that. Another huge thing that we could do is to release the all-cause mortality statistics on a daily level. Why can't we do that? We have it. This is being done in the UK, by the way. They are releasing all-cause mortality statistics at a granular level. They mark the recent data as provisional, but they're releasing it. We are now tracking this pandemic using the official reported statistics, which really was not really depicting ground reality in the month of May. So we could do much better with a statistical dissemination. The second part of this question is, how do we reduce the phase of erasure? One simple thing would be to, put it in our school textbooks. Fact is, nobody really, remembers these things anyway. Even if you put it in the history textbook, it's not like people remember it. My more humble thing is that it should be taught in medical schools. I'll tell you why. I don't think a huge part of the policymakers who gave advice to the prime minister or prime ministers around the world in managing the pandemic were from the medical field. They were epidemiologists and doctors, and wisely so. Right? The fact is that these guys in India definitely had no clue about migration, had no clue about past pandemics. Right? And I've talked to some of these guys who advised the prime minister, and after they read my book or we've had the chat, they're like, what, if we knew this, we would have thought very differently about the migration crisis. We would have told, let's run the trains first and then announce a lockdown, for instance. Right? So there should be definitely more kind of interdisciplinarity in the medical field. They should know because they are the ones who are going to advise, rightly so. But they need to take into account the economic impact, the impact on migration, and so on. So either you start drilling this down in medical schools, or you basically try and make those fields learn more from other fields. So erasure, so that's one way to reduce erasure. Keep writing, talking about it, memorialize it. Why is it that in 2019 we remembered the 100 years of the Jallianwala Bagh tragedy, right? But not the 100 years of influenza pandemic. Right? Both were 100 years. In Jallianwala Bagh tragedy took few hundred lives. Influenza took 20 million lives. Right? Both happened at roughly the same months. Just a few months give or take. But we remember Jallianwala Bagh because it's a clear enemy. The enemy was the British. In the case of influenza, there was no clearly identifiable enemy. So we need to have memorials on what we've lost easily more than 1 million lives this year purely because of COVID-19. I have a op-ed piece coming Times of India this Sunday, which talks about this. We have to do much more to recognize. If you live in La La Land saying only 200,000 people have died, that's not the situation in 2021. We might not have had too many deaths in 2020, but this year, it's completely different ballgame. There's one question on shift in policy paradigm. I don't know if the question is from 1918 to now. Definitely, for example, this idea of a coordinated lockdown, or this was not there earlier. 1918 influenza, you had economic devastation, but you never had a national lockdown in the kind that we had this or last year, right? And I think from last year to this year, we moved from national lockdowns, which I think most people say are too harsh, to localized restrictions. But I do think restrictions are important. You can't contain a pandemic without having no restrictions. You can't it's too costly to just let a pandemic run its course. So there has to be some restrictions. And I think now we do have some handle on how to track that, how to track those restrictions. For example, Google Mobility Trends gives you fantastic data on a daily basis. You kind of see, what's the mobility levels across the country and so on. So these are some of the things which are happening at the policy level. Vaccination is, of course, the big story. But my focus has been on how to integrate history. And right now, my main focus is on two things. One is migration, and the other is in excess mortality. These are the two things.
Sorry, I had the second part of the question was, how did you get the number 30 million? I mean, it would be great if you can talk. Internal mic.
Oh, yeah. And in response to that, I sent you a link on the chat box, which is a link to my Google site. Right. So unfortunately, you can't cite this unless you're a chemistry student, because in chemistry nowadays, you can cite Twitter threads, believe it or not. Okay. So Twitter threads are citable. I think it's great. It would change my life as a researcher if Twitter threads are citable, because I keep making these Twitter threads. So I have a Twitter thread of that 30 million number, right? But it tells you, it's an estimate, right? Obviously, it's an estimate. But I should tell you, there is an official number now of 11 million from the Labor Ministry. So Labor Ministry has given a figure saying that state governments told them collectively that 11 million people went back. So that's the figure that's the official figure. And the Shramik train figure is about 6 to 7 million. Right? So that's it. Now I've done some basic estimations using some data. So you see, there's a Twitter thread on how many people move back. You'll see the estimations out there. Similarly, I have a lot of Twitter threads on each state's excess mortality in the recent weeks and so on, and also my working papers on that website. That website also has a list of various dashboards, which are excellent resources to track the pandemic in real time.
Thank you very much all for your questions, and Chinmay for your thought-provoking presentation, and of course for the answer to these questions that raises a very interesting debate. I'm sure we would all want to stay longer. I myself have like 5 questions. I would love to keep it ongoing. Unfortunately, we do have to end the recording. Perhaps we can take a couple of minutes offline. Additionally, I do recommend you to follow Chinmay on his social networks, and of course get a copy of the book. I think today's talk was more than a motivation to go and purchase that very, very good looking and interesting book. So I'm gonna give it to Anisha to wrap up the session. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Sergio. But I would just like to thank Chinmay sir for such a wonderful presentation. I mean, I have never attended something like this. It was like goosebumps coming up. Okay, so maybe we are so wrong, and it was wonderful. It was unimaginable. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shamika.
Thanks.
So on behalf of all of us, I think I'll be thanking Chinmay for this wonderful session and for accepting the invitation and coming in. Thank you.
Thanks, but I have to answer this one question because it's a great question.
Okay.
On literature. Fuad has this question on literature. I did look at a lot of literary accounts because I did find it tough to get first-person accounts. And interestingly, people are scared to write about pandemics in diaries and so on. Maybe because it's a negative event and so on. I got a great book called Smriti Chitre, which is a Marathi memoir written in the 1930s and recently translated in English, which gives a terrific first-person account of plague and influenza. So it's a person who lived through both these pandemics and their chapter level kind of this. So I mentioned that in my book. I cited at length. So that's one fantastic piece. Samskara by U.R. Anandamurthy is a classic which describes plague and caste relations in southern India. You have so my book actually cites a lot of the relevant literary kind of works. There's a book called A Ballad of Remittent Fever, which was translated just a few years back, which is on epidemics in Eastern India. So it's a fair amount. In fact, I have a Twitter thread on literature and pandemics, so you should check that.
All right, we will take more questions in like the offline part of it. So just let me formally close this session, and we will see each other in the next session, which will be a little offline if Chinmay is okay with staying another 10 minutes with us.
Sure.
So thanking Chinmay for officially on record for this session. I would like to also thank our co-organizers, Julia and Sergio. Thank you to our support team, which is Arun, Varsha, and Aktas for being there. Thank you to all our participants for this wonderful question. And I would also like to mention that this 15th of July, we will be back again with another book discussion, which is Macroeconomics and Introduction with Alex Thomas. Bye and catch you soon. And we stop.